So question one, we're gonna sort them into real shocks and aggregate demand shocks. A real shock is when there's an unexpected event that occurs in the economy, and aggregate demand shock is when an event that causes increase or decrease in demand. So we'll look at we can sort these. The first one is real shock, aggregate demand shock, because this increases or decreases the demand for of consumers. This is just a real shock. It's an unexpected event. Real shock again. Rise in sales taxes. This will change the demand of consumers. This is again the same thing. The demand of consumers. Fear. We talked about a lot. Changes demand for consumers. This is a real shock. New inventions coming. And then the last one is accurate demand shock. Question two. According to Figure 32.2 from the Modern Economics textbook, there were 11 recessions since World War II, and only one of them where was where the unemployment rate was over 10%. And almost every time the unemployment rate actually peaks right after the recession occurs. So, and we can clearly see 8 times since World War II this has occurred. Question three. When an inflation rate rises, the solo growth rate rises too, or remains unchanged. Um, are real shocks negative shocks? No, as it says in question one, real shocks cannot doesn't have to be negative. They can also be positive shocks, but they have to increase or decrease the potential growth rate. That's the key thing about real shocks. Question five. What is when negative shocks hit? What is typically happens to the long run aggregate supply? So when negative shock hits, the long run aggregate supply curves actually shifts left, decreases, which decreases.
Question 6 asked, when negative real shocks hit, what typically happens to the aggregate demand curve? Does it shift left, right, or stay in the same place? So the answer to this is that real shocks do not really shift the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve is only affected by aggregate demand shocks, such as increases in taxes or general fear of the economy. Real shocks will affect real GDP growth rate, but it doesn't really affect the aggregate demand curve shifting inward, and we'll see different scenarios later. Question 7 asks, using 32.1, if a negative real shock hits, shifting the average growth per year by 2 percentage points, what will happen to real growth? Will it be positive or negative? Would you call the resulting economic conditions a recession? Now, a negative real shock of 2 percentage points would shift the real growth in the negative direction. But, however, the real GDP growth rate would rest at a rate of 1%. Now, I do not believe this is as severe as a negative 5% real GDP growth rate, which is the common range for a recession. This is still a decline in GDP growth. However, the GDP is still growing. It's not declining. It's not shrinking, essentially. So I would not call this a recession. I would just call this a downturn in GDP growth. Question 8 asks, what does a negative real shock do to inflation? Does it rise or fall or remain unchanged? B, what does a negative real shock do to spending growth? Does it rise, fall, or remain unchanged? And then C, what does a fall in spending growth, a shift inward of the aggregate demand curve, do to real growth? And let's take a look. So firstly, inflation will rise in response to a negative real shock. We can see that here with figure 32.7, that a negative real shock will shift real GDP growth from this original position of 3 to negative 1%, and this will increase the inflation rate. With B, a negative real shock will not cause any change in the spending growth rate, i.e. the aggregate demand curve, and this is because the only things that shift the aggregate demand curve are shifts in spending growth or aggregate demand shocks. With C, we see aggregate demand shock shifting the aggregate demand curve inward, and this will decrease real growth. We can see the situation with figure 32.14, where the original equilibrium position of A, there is an economic aggregate demand shock that shifts the aggregate demand curve inward, and we can see real growth decrease from 3% to negative 1% at point B. Thank you. I really hope you enjoyed this presentation.
So with question number 9, when you're trying to figure out the change in real growth, with the first one, it's a rise. With the second one, it's a fall. And with the third, it remains unchanged. And the fourth one, there's a huge fall, big fall. And then with the fifth, there's a rise. With 10, using like rise over run, you can know that that m plus v is equal to 7, and then using the formulas, you know that it's 1% plus inflation, and so you just subtract and you can figure out that inflation is 6%. And then in the part B, the inflation rate would become 14%. With question number 11, with the short run aggregate supply, when the inflation is greater than people expect, it shifts up, and when the inflation is less than people expect, it will eventually shift down. And then with the Solow growth rate, the when the real GDP is above, then it eventually shifts to the left over the next year or so. And then when the real GDP growth is below the Solow rate, it eventually shifts to the right. And basically, to explain this, why those are two equivalent, well, graphically speaking, when the line moves up, it also moves to the left, and when the line moves down, it also moves to the right, which also relates to the of inflation and real versus actual inflation and the Solow growth rate as compared to the real GDP.
So question 12 asks to complete the following sentences. With a real shock, when real growth is worse than usual, inflation is higher than usual. And with aggregate demand shock, when real growth is worse than usual, inflation is lower than usual. And question 14 gives this graph of supply and demand for workers offering a supply of labor and businesses demanding the labor. So suppose labor demand falls, shifting to the left as in the figure. What does the short run supply curve for labor looks like? And that's the line in blue on the graph. Recalling your basic supply and demand model, does this fall in labor demand then create a surplus or shortage of workers, and it creates a surplus? And according to the basic supply and demand model, what will happen to the price of labor over time? So the price of labor will decrease because there is a smaller demand.